In Athens, the price of a woman's body was 2 barley loaves, less than a jug of sour wine. Not a myth, but an entry in the city's ledgers. Freedom was a temple for men and a cage for the women beneath it. Who paid for the Parthenon's perfection? The answer lies not in marble, but in flesh, burned, branded, and broken. Chronicles stay silent. The bones in the drains do not. If you value truth, subscribe. When the ledger closes, pain still speaks. In the backstreets near the agora, under the smell of roasted grain and wine, stood the Pornea state-licensed brothels. A night with a girl cost 2 barley loaves. The same city that taught the world democracy had turned the bodies of its most voiceless into its most reliable revenue. Historians record that some girls serviced 6 to 10 men a day until infection, pregnancy, or collapse made them unfit for work. When that happened, they were replaced. A doctor's visit cost more than a new slave. Athens called itself the mother of philosophy. But philosophy requires silence, and that silence was bought with the screams of women in the night. Every polished column, every lyric ode, every marble statue was paid for in flesh. The question is not whether Athens was cruel. The question is how cruelty became beautiful. Athens called it order. But behind that word lay a system so precise, so administrative, that it turned violation into infrastructure. The brothel wasn't a shadow of the city, it was one of its pillars. When the statesman Solon reformed Athens in the 6th century BCE, his laws are said to have founded state-regulated brothels to keep men from harming respectable women, the texts claim. Historians debate the legend, but the fiscal records don't. Pimping, known as porneon tax, was a recognized civic contribution. The revenue didn't disappear into private pockets, it flowed into the same treasury that funded the temples of the gods and the marble steps of the Acropolis. The city had found a way to convert humiliation into public architecture. Each brothel was catalogued and inspected, its prices standardized like grain or olive oil. Every woman inside bore an identifying mark, a brand on her thigh or hip, linking her not only to her owner, but indirectly to the state. Her suffering was taxable, her body a civic resource. The city counted her not as shame, but as income. Inscriptions recovered near Piraeus, record fees paid to the goddess Aphrodite by the keepers of houses. The language is careful sacred offering, not blood money. The brothel had been absorbed into religion, its transactions rebranded as worship. Men paid coin, women paid flesh, and the gods received their share. Economists of antiquity now estimate that state prostitution brought thousands of drachmas into Athens annually, enough to finance the repair of city walls or fund several triremes. The currency of the empire, stamped with Athena's owl, may well have been minted from the profits of the porneia. But this system wasn't simply tolerated, it was justified. Philosophers argued that controlled vice preserved social order. Better, they said, to contain male lust within the brothel than risk polluting wives and virgins. In this moral calculus, the suffering of slaves became the mechanism of virtue for others. Athens had engineered an ethical paradox, enslaved pain as civic stability. Inside the porneia, that philosophy took on the texture of hell. The rooms were low and airless, the floors packed with straw and filth. Curtains divided cubicles, but offered no privacy, only thin fabric to muffle the sounds of endurance. The women inside were assets under contract. When one was sick, her absence was logged as a fiscal loss. When she died, her replacement was filed as acquisition. Account books discovered on ostraka broken pottery used as writing tablets record chilling entries. 1 Nubian scarred, 8 obols. 1 Thracian girl unbroken, 12 obols. Each phrase is an epitaph disguised as bookkeeping. The system extended outward. Artisans made the locks for the doors, blacksmiths forged the branding irons, physicians attended births and abortions, merchants sold oil for the lamps that illuminated the acts. Every layer of the city, knowingly or not, profited from its commerce in flesh. The economy of suffering was not peripheral, it was civic participation. And yet the moral brilliance of the scheme was its invisibility. The men who debated ethics in the agora could dine at the same establishments that sold despair as service and still call themselves civilized. Athens did not hide its brothels, it integrated them. Public sin became public order. One surviving law from the orator Demosthenes declares, "A man may not marry a prostitute, yet may use her freely, for the city does not forbid what it profits from." That sentence distills the machinery of hypocrisy, the distinction between purity as symbol and corruption as necessity. The city pretended to separate them, but economically they were married. By the late 5th century BCE, the porneia had become an industry. Slaves were imported from Thrace, Asia Minor, Egypt, women of every color, accent, and age. Athens' cosmopolitan pride masked a marketplace of anguish. Each foreign accent in the brothel was proof of conquest. The empire didn't just expand through war, it expanded through procurement. And still, this system was praised as pragmatic, even moral. Because Athens' genius was not its cruelty, it was its ability to rationalize cruelty as reason, to transform the violation of bodies into the discipline of the polis. Athenian democracy functioned because someone had to absorb what the system denied: its rage, its appetite, its contradictions. The brothel was not an aberration. It was the safety valve of philosophy. The Parthenon rose pristine and white, while beneath it, the city's darker temples pulsed brick sweat and blood. Athens had found a perfect equilibrium. Men debated virtue under daylight, and women paid for it after dark. If commerce could sanctify cruelty, what would happen when that cruelty itself became spectacle? When pain was not just profit, but entertainment. The brothel was never hidden in Athens, it was performed. Its walls were not meant to conceal sin, but to choreograph it. In a city that worshipped theatre, cruelty itself became a stage production. Every new slave entered this theatre the same way through ritualized pain. When a girl was purchased, her initiation was public, an event for regular clients and new patrons alike. She would be stripped, her body inspected as property, and then raped while others looked on. The act was not spontaneous, it was policy. The goal was to break resistance, to erase the boundary between pain and obedience. In that moment, a child became merchandise. Archaeologists have found graffiti from Athenian brothel walls, etched by laughing patrons, crude stick figures, prices jokes about training new girls. Some inscriptions even used the same verbs found in plays performed at the Dionysian festivals, proof that the languages of theatre and torture were interchangeable. In Athens, violence was not a breakdown of civilization, it was its texture. The act of domination repeated nightly became an art form. The city consumed without guilt. A good client was not just one who paid, but one who performed cruelty well, who elicited the right reactions. The more a woman screamed, the more the men laughed. Athenian rhetoric justified this degradation as a kind of education. The philosopher Xenophon wrote that self-control separated free men from slaves. Yet, in practice, the city built an economy that rewarded the opposite indulgence at the expense of others' pain. The contradiction was not hidden. It was flaunted. Athens built its moral identity atop the spectacle of its own depravity. Virginity in this economy was premium stock. A fresh girl could sell for 10 times the price of a seasoned one. Her first assault fetched the highest bids conducted a ceremony, a grotesque parody of marriage. Witnesses toasted the act as if celebrating a civic virtue. Some records even describe wagers on how long she would resist before breaking. Imagine the courtyard torchlight trembling against the stone wine, sloshing in clay cups, men jeering while a small figure gasps on the ground. Her body still growing is split open before the crowd. The laughter echoes into the night, mingling with the hymns from the nearby temple. This was Athens' truest theatre. And as the empire's wealth grew, so did the hunger for novelty. Brothel owners staged contests: who could dominate a resisting girl fastest, who could leave a mark without drawing blood. These games blurred into the city's festivals, where pain and performance shared the same applause. Even art joined the complicity. Vase paintings from the 5th century depict scenes of assault. As decorative motifs, women pinned under men, their limbs stylized into elegance. The figures are painted with the same care given to depictions of gods. Beauty, violence, and commerce fused into one grammar. The Greeks called it kalos kagathos, the noble and the good. But the word beauty here was a kind of anesthesia, a way to make suffering look divine. The brutality of the porneia extended beyond its walls. On festival nights, the city itself became an open brothel. During Dionysian celebrations, prostitutes were offered to crowds for free, symbolizing abundance and fertility. Priests blessed the acts as divine communion. Drunken men spilled into the streets, dragging women from temples, turning prayers into orgies sanctioned by faith. When the revelry ended, the women were carried back, bleeding broken, some barely conscious. The city called it worship. What Athens had achieved was nothing less than a social miracle. It had fused piety, pleasure, and punishment into one seamless system. The act of desecration no longer violated morality, it defined it. And so pain became performance. Every blow was choreography, every scream part of the civic symphony. The body ceased to be human and became metaphor, a stage upon which men could prove their power. Philosophers could test their theories, and artists could immortalize obedience. The city that built tragedy as an art form turned real human tragedy into spectacle. Even the spectators forgot to distinguish between stage and life. The audience at Dionysian plays laughed at rape scenes by Aristophanes, then left the theatre and bought tickets for the same act in flesh. Their laughter was both participation and absolution. To Athenian eyes, this was balance pain given meaning. Violence made beautiful cruelty disguised as order. But every performance leaves a residue. Behind the laughter lingered silence, thousands of voices erased so completely that even memory forgot their shape. Athens had achieved what every empire dreams of, not just to commit atrocity, but to aestheticize it. If Athens could turn cruelty into art, what happens when art becomes law? When the economy itself runs on the arithmetic of pain? Every empire invents a language to disguise its cruelty. Athens' word was order. behind that word hid a precise mathematical machine, an economy built on the conversion of pain into coin. The brothel was not a vice, it was an enterprise. Its profits filled the same coffers that financed democracy's marble warships and festivals. In a city of thinkers, suffering was balanced like a ledger. The flesh of women became a fiscal instrument, measurable, taxable, expendable. Records from the 4th century BCE describe the porneon tax collected by the telonai, or public revenue officers. Every pimp known as a pornoboskos was registered with the city. Each woman he owned was a line item. 10 drachmas per slave per moon. 1 surviving tablet notes. Paid to the goddess and to the state. The coin stamped with Athena's owl carried a double-meaning wisdom above exploitation below. This wasn't chaos, it was regulation. Athens had turned desire into administration. The same bureaucrats who calculated the grain supply and naval budgets also counted women's bodies as public assets. The logic was, elegant men's pleasure became civic duty, their payments patriotic offerings. The state didn't just tolerate prostitution, it depended on it. The money fed the building of temples, subsidized public games, paid the jurors who judged the poor. The system's morality was circular. The same democracy that denied women citizenship was partially financed by their degradation. Economists estimate that the trade generated enough income annually to fund several triremes, the backbone of Athens' military. Each gleaming warship that carried Athenian democracy across the Aegean may have been built quite literally on the blood of enslaved girls. The empire was expanding, and with each new conquest came fresh supplies. Captive women from Thrace, Scythia, Lydia, and Egypt were sold in markets like livestock. Price lists survive. Blonde Thracian girls fetched higher sums. Darker-skinned Nubians were cheaper, but valued for endurance. Athens had created a racialized price index centuries before the term existed. What made this more horrifying was its banality. Philosophers debated the ethics of governance, while the marketplace beneath them turned human suffering into liquidity. One orator argued in court that prostitutes were the necessary oil for society's machinery. It was an economy with no waste. Every act of violence converted into value, every scar into coin. Even the religious institutions were complicit. Temples to Aphrodite in Piraeus and Corinth maintained sacred brothels, their earnings offered to the goddess. The priests called it divine reciprocity. Pleasure, given prosperity received. Beneath the marble altars, ledgers recorded the income. Faith itself had become a form of accounting. The brilliance of this system lay in its invisibility. No one in Athens thought of it as exploitation, they called it maintenance. Just as citizens paid taxes for roads, they paid for the regulation of vice. The city absorbed cruelty into the rhythm of civic life until no one could tell the difference between sin and policy. Even the term porneia, the root of our modern pornography, originally meant the commerce of bodies. In Athens, that commerce was as vital as agriculture or trade. The marketplace of desire ran alongside the marketplace of goods. The cries of women were just another sound in the symphony of civic prosperity. But there was another economy running beneath the visible one, the emotional economy of complicity. Each transaction allowed freemen to reaffirm their freedom. To own, to use, to discard, that was the definition of citizenship. Freedom in Athens meant the power to dehumanize. The brothel was the city's mirror, reflecting the hidden logic of democracy equality for some dependency for the rest. When a woman's body broke, she was replaced. When she conceived, she was beaten or forced to abort. These were not moral failures, they were business losses. Profit required continuity, not compassion. And so the city thrived. The Parthenon rose. Philosophers taught, soldiers marched. Beneath every triumph lay a quiet arithmetic. For every coin spent on glory, someone bled unseen. If Athens was the cradle of civilization, it was also its first factory one that manufactured not goods but hierarchy. The raw material was pain. The final product was beauty. Even centuries later, when historians praised the city's balance of reason and passion, they rarely asked what that balance cost. Because to question it would mean acknowledging that democracy's foundation was not marble, it was skin. The economy of flesh was more than commerce, it was ideology. The belief that some lives could be consumed so that others could think, write, and build. And that belief would echo across centuries, carried forward in empires that called themselves civilized. If Athens could turn human suffering into revenue, what happened when the law itself began protecting that revenue, transforming justice into the language of ownership? Every empire begins by defining who counts as human. Athens achieved this through law. The Athenian legal system, celebrated as the foundation of Western justice, was also the first to codify sexual domination as property management. The courtroom of the polis was a theatre of logic. Orators invoked reason precedent and divine order. But beneath the marble rhetoric lay a brutal truth. The law existed not to restrain cruelty, but to organize it. In Athens, a woman's body could not own anything, not her labor, her children, not even her pain. She was in the language of the law ktema, a possession. Her life unfolded between clauses, her suffering itemized. The same statutes that protected olive groves and houses listed female slaves among movable goods. If a prostitute tried to flee her crime, was not rebellion but theft. She was accused of stealing herself. Court records reveal the legal poetry of this logic. She absconded, depriving her master of revenue. The body became an instrument of debt. Escape was an act of embezzlement. For Athens, legality was theology. The law sanctified the hierarchy between free and enslaved male and female body and mind. The polis called this justice, each thing in its proper place. But justice in Athens had a sound, the crack of leather across flesh. Athenian courts permitted the physical torture of slaves as a legitimate form of truth extraction. The rationale was simple. A slave's words were unreliable until verified by pain. Testimony under agony was deemed more trustworthy than speech in freedom. In effect, the city institutionalized the idea that truth itself required violence. A woman's scream recorded in court proceedings was not considered evidence of suffering. It was evidence of ownership. The louder she screamed, the clearer her master's rights became. The philosopher Aristotle would later write, "Some men are slaves by nature." He was not speaking metaphorically. The body in Greek law was an object with utility. Its ability to feel pain was merely proof of its function. Under this system, the rape of a free woman was a civic offense, a violation of another man's property. But the rape of a slave was no crime at all. Her body was already a public domain of use. In legal terms, she could not be dishonored because she had no honor to lose. One preserved oration from Demosthenes defends a client accused of abusing a prostitute. You cannot injure what belongs to the marketplace, for the city itself profits from her trade. That sentence, calm procedural, turns atrocity into paperwork. It captures the cold arithmetic of Athenian morality. The greater the public utility, the smaller the moral cost. To modernize, this may seem monstrous, but for Athens, it was reason. The law was the machinery that turned cruelty into balance. It ensured that every act of domination could be reconciled with civic harmony. The slave's pain became the lubricant for the citizen's conscience. In this structure, even compassion was regulated. Masters could pardon their slaves, but only as an expression of ownership. Mercy itself was property. The law gave free men the pleasure of benevolence, a gift that reinforced their dominance. This wasn't law as restraint. It was law as theatre and elegant fiction designed to convert violence into order. Court proceedings were public spectacles. Citizens gathered in the agora to hear orators debate, not morality, but value. Was the woman's defiance worth the cost of her punishment? Should her owner receive compensation for lost labor? The audience listened as if attending a play. Justice was entertainment with consequences. Even temples obeyed this logic. When enslaved women fled into sacred spaces, priests often returned them for a fee. Sanctuary could be purchased, redemption privatized. The gods themselves, it seemed, respected property rights. In a world where the law sanctified ownership, what room was left for the soul? None. Athens had achieved a perfect symmetry democracy, above slavery, below. The citizen voted, the slave obeyed, and both believed in the same order. The irony is cruel and precise. The civilization that birthed the word freedom also defined freedom by its opposite. The slave's suffering was not a deviation from justice, it was its evidence. When philosophers like Socrates and Plato spoke of virtue, they rarely mentioned the brothel, the branding iron, or the courtroom whips. They didn't have to. The system worked too elegantly to question. The law, like philosophy, depended on forgetting the bodies it consumed. Thus, Athens proved that law can civilize brutality without erasing it. That legality and violence are not enemies, but partners. The city had discovered the oldest secret of empire. Once you define pain as property, cruelty ceases to be a crime, it becomes administration. If law could sanctify ownership, what happened when religion joined the same project, turning rape itself into ritual and blood into worship? Athens did not hide its cruelty, it sanctified it. The temple and the brothel were two faces of the same altar. The philosopher's marble city called itself enlightened, but the light that gleamed on its white columns also illuminated blood, offered in the name of gods who demanded pleasure as worship. When law defined women's bodies as property, religion gave that property a halo. The brothel became an extension of the temple, and violation became a form of prayer. During the annual festival of Dionysia, when the city erupted in song and wine, the boundary between celebration and cruelty dissolved. Prostitutes, many of them slaves branded with iron, were handed to the crowds as gifts from the gods. Priests called it orgia sacred frenzy, a moment when mortals and divinity merged through ecstasy. But the reality was grotesque, a state-sanctioned mass rape disguised as ritual. Contemporary sources describe the scene with chilling neutrality. Torches flickered through the streets. Men carried idols of Dionysus, while chanting hymns, cups of wine sloshing over their hands. The offerings were led through the crowd, naked, trembling, adorned with garlands. Some were paraded on litters, as if brides. Others were thrown onto temple floors. The priest's blessing came before the screams. The wine and blood shall mingle. One inscription reads that the god may be pleased. Those who died of their injuries were said to be chosen their suffering proof of divine favor. Their bodies were dragged outside the city and left among animal remains, a feast for vultures and silence. The act was not a lapse in reason, it was ritualized governance. The festival released the city's collective appetite, cleansing it through spectacle. Philosophers later praised Dionysian rites as the suspension of boundaries, a necessary catharsis for civic order. Pain was the price of harmony. In this way, Athens perfected what every empire learns. If you cannot suppress cruelty, ritualize it. Call it holiness. Even the goddess Aphrodite, symbol of love, was drafted into this system. Her temples doubled as houses of sacred service. Women dedicated to her worship, the hierodouloa, were slaves trained to perform sexual rites for paying worshippers. Each coin placed on the altar became an offering, each act of penetration a prayer. And so the divine economy continued. Piety became transaction. The same hand that struck in lust could also make an offering. Sin and salvation became indistinguishable. What Athens called religion was, in truth, the moral camouflage of a commercial empire. Every sacrifice, every hymn, every libation of wine masked an unspoken trade human pain for civic prosperity. There is an ancient fragment attributed to a priest of Eleusis describing a young girl's death during one such festival. He writes not with guilt, but with wonder. Her body trembled as the god entered her. We took it as sign the harvest would be good. For the priest, the girl's suffering was not tragedy, it was evidence of cosmic order. Athens' genius lay in this inversion to make violence sacred, so that no one could oppose it without committing blasphemy. The city's rituals trained its citizens to see cruelty not as corruption, but as necessity, even beauty. Every empire that followed, from Rome's gladiatorial games to medieval inquisitions, would borrow this theology: pain as purification, domination as divine will. But there was something deeper beneath the chants and incense, the psychology of complicity. When citizens participate in ritualized harm, they no longer feel guilty, they feel chosen. To harm in the name of gods is to be righteous. And so the Athenians learned to look upon the bleeding body of a slave and see not horror but holiness. They had achieved a form of moral perfection, a cruelty so complete it believed itself virtuous. When night fell after the festivals, the priests washed the altars clean. The blood dried to dust between the stones. The city slept, its conscience rinsed by ritual. And in the silence that followed, the victims' names vanished, because in Athens, salvation required forgetting the sacrificed. If religion could disguise violence as purity, what would happen when the crowd no longer needed gods at all? When suffering itself became entertainment, laughter, and art. Every civilization eventually discovers its favorite form of denial. Athens chose laughter. By the 5th century BCE, cruelty no longer hid in the shadows of temples, it strutted on stage. The same society that birthed democracy and tragedy also invented the world's first comedy of pain. In the open-air theatres beneath the Acropolis, thousands of citizens gathered under the bright sun to watch scenes of beatings, rapes, and humiliation played for laughs. Women's screams became rhythm, their suffering timing. A slave girl dragged by her hair, a prostitute mocked for her excess, a husband boasting of his wife's violation, all of it provoked applause. This was Athens' other ritual. The festival of Dionysia's theatre competitions. The city called it education through laughter. But what was being taught was not virtue, it was anesthetic. Playwrights like Aristophanes turned female pain into punchlines. His audience's men, who had likely visited brothels the night before, roared at scenes that mirrored their own crimes. The women on stage were caricatures, deceitful, lustful, hysterical, deserving of punishment. The crowd's laughter fused shame with amusement until cruelty became culture. Every joke reinforced a political truth. Freedom was a male privilege, and laughter was its anthem. The irony is suffocating. In the same breath that Athens praised Sophrosyne, self-control, it celebrated the loss of control through humor. The philosopher's lecture and the pimp's trade were two sides of the same coin. Both turned human bodies into instruments for moral instruction, one through rhetoric, the other through ridicule. Vase paintings from this period confirm what the plays implied. Cups and symposium vessels depict scenes of forced sex and beatings etched in exquisite detail. A man grips a woman's throat. Another forces her head down. Around the image, floral borders bloom, violence as decoration. To drink from such a cup was to normalize the act it portrayed. A man could toast to beauty while staring at the image of someone's degradation. Art became anesthesia. And yet, Athens convinced itself this was civilization. The philosopher Aristotle praised tragedy for purging emotions. Comedy, he said, exposed the ridiculous. But the ridiculous in Athens was always the powerless women slaves foreigners. The city's laughter was the sound of hierarchy made human. Public amusement became a civic duty. A citizen who laughed at suffering affirmed his own superiority. The theatre taught him that pain was order, that each scream reinforced the city's logic. And so, Athens perfected a psychological machinery that every empire would later inherit. When the powerful can turn atrocity into entertainment, empathy dies quietly. This was not accidental. Laughter stabilized the system. It prevented revolt by transforming guilt into joy. The laughter of thousands drowned the cries of hundreds. Even philosophers, those self-anointed guardians of morality, participated. Plato in his Laws warned against excessive comedy, but not because of compassion for its victims. He feared that laughter weakened discipline. The suffering of women didn't trouble him. Laughter's chaos did. Athens wanted cruelty, but it wanted cruelty tidy. In this ordered brutality, pain had become aesthetic, something to be arranged, performed, and consumed. The audience, high on civic pride, left the theatre refreshed, purified by irony. Their democracy had achieved a oracle, the conversion of horror into harmony. What Athens built was more than a culture of domination. It was an emotional economy. Pain fed not just money or ritual, but pleasure. The laughter of free men was the city's most honest prayer. Centuries later, Roman crowds would cheer gladiators tearing each other apart. Medieval Christians would crowd public squares for burnings. Modern audiences would pay to watch the humiliation of others on screens. The lineage begins here, in the laughter under the Acropolis, where philosophy and cruelty first shook hands. But one question lingers like a ghost under the roar of applause. If a civilization can laugh at its victims, how long before it forgets they were human at all? What happens when cruelty stops being spectacle and becomes science? When the body itself is studied, dissected and modified for profit. Athens claimed to revere the human body. It built statues of perfect proportions, studied muscles, mapped veins, and celebrated form as divine geometry. But beneath the marble ideal, another kind of anatomy flourished, the anatomy of profit. Here, medicine did not heal. It optimized exploitation. In the city's brothels, women's bodies were treated like tools of production maintained only long enough to preserve their market value. Pregnancy disease exhaustion. These were not tragedies, but malfunctions. And Athens, the birthplace of science, devised methods to repair them. Ancient medical papyri and Hippocratic treatises reveal the cold precision of this cruelty. Midwives, often slaves themselves, were trained not to nurture, but to terminate. Abortions were standard business, called maintenance procedures. When a prostitute became pregnant, it was seen as damage to goods, a threat to profit flow. The solution was quick, mechanical, and merciless. Insert the sharpened stick coated in oil. One instruction reads, "Until the bleeding begins. The womb must be cleansed before the moon's next turn." If the woman survived, she was sent back to work within days. If she died, the owner recorded the loss as an expense and purchased another. Life in the Athenian economy of sex was cheaper than rest. The tools of medicine, herbs, bronze instruments, boiling oil were the empire's first technologies of control. Physicians called themselves rationalists, distancing their craft from superstition. Yet their rationality served the same old god profit. Pain was simply the cost of efficiency. Some treatises even advise how to preserve a prostitute's beauty while concealing disease. Oils to hide sores, perfumes to disguise infection, tight bindings to give the illusion of youth. Medicine was not cure, it was camouflage. The irony is unbearable. Athens, home of Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath, also wrote the earliest manuals for sexual coercion disguised as care. The physician and the pimp shared the same language maintenance regulation balance. Their goal was identical: to keep the machine running. Archaeological evidence tells the rest. Skeletons excavated from brothel sites show pelvic fractures, healed rib breaks, spine deformities from repeated assault. Some skulls bear signs of blunt trauma and surgical scraping, primitive trepanations done perhaps to treat trauma or madness. The line between doctor and torturer blurred until it disappeared. In this world, the female body was not sacred, but experimental. Physicians studied menstruation, childbirth, and infection using slaves as living specimens. Observations recorded in clinical detachment. She expired after expulsion of matter. The pulse ceased without convulsion. There is no mention of the woman's name. Her death is data. Athens' scientific revolution, celebrated in modern textbooks, was built on these nameless bodies. Knowledge advanced, but empathy regressed. The same men who mapped the stars and reasoned about ethics reduced women to biological instruments. It was not ignorance, it was design. Because science, like law and religion, became another branch of the same empire of control. Each discipline, the priest, the jurist, the physician, spoke a different language, but served the same logic that human suffering could be quantified, managed, and profited from. When medicine entered the brothel, cruelty gained precision. The old brutality of whips and branding irons was replaced by procedure. A woman no longer had to be beaten into submission. Her biology would do it for her. This was the birth of a new kind of violence, medicalized cruelty. Cold, efficient, unremarkable. It survived long after Athens fell. When Roman physicians experimented on slaves, when medieval doctors bled women for hysteria, when modern medicine tested drugs on the powerless, the Athenian principle endured pain as pedagogy, suffering as data. The city that carved the human body into art also turned it into a laboratory. Its beauty was built on dissection, its reason on erasure. In the dim light of the brothel, a woman lies still after another procedure. Her owner counts the coins. The physician washes his hands. The cynic sleeps certain of its virtue. Because Athens never saw itself as cruel, only rational. But reason has another face. What happens when the rational system begins to lose control, when the slaves run, when the bodies revolt, and when even the gods begin to take bribes for betrayal? There is one act every empire fears more than rebellion escape, because to flee is to reject the system's logic entirely. And for Athens, escape was treason, not against a master, but against the city itself. When a slave woman ran, she did not simply vanish. She disrupted the chain of profit, threatened the illusion of order. Her body was an asset, her absence a theft. And so, Athens responded with precision, turning punishment into public pedagogy. The court decrees called it diaphugon hoton, the one who escaped herself. The phrase is poetic and monstrous. To flee was to commit self-theft, to steal one's own existence from the market. The city could not tolerate that kind of logic. It had to reclaim her, not just physically, but symbolically. Runaway notices were posted in the agora. Slave girl branded thigh scar over left eye, answers to Thalia. Her body described like livestock, her price listed beneath. Those who captured her could claim a reward half her value in silver. The entire city became an extension of the brothel's walls. Every citizen a potential jailer. If caught, the punishment was theatre. At festivals, when the crowds gathered for Dionysian celebration, captured fugitives were paraded through the streets. The same torches that lit commodities and rituals illuminated their agony. Crucifixion was common bodies nailed to planks outside the city gates, left for days as warnings. Some were hung from scaffolds near the brothel district, so others could see what freedom cost. The language of justice blurred into ritual again. Priests blessed the executions. Magistrates collected the fines. The gods, it seemed, sided with order. But the cruelty ran deeper than the spectacle. It seeped into the psychology of everyone who watched. The citizen who laughed at a slave's punishment felt safer, cleaner. The slave who saw it learned to fear not only the lash, but her own hope. Athens ruled not just through violence, but through the internalization of despair. The system had perfected its circle. Law legitimized pain. Religion sanctified it. Medicine refined it. And punishment renewed it. Each pillar reinforced the next. Even sanctuary, that last imagined refuge, was for sale. Slaves who fled into temples begged the gods for protection, but priests paid discreetly by owners returned them. Sanctuary was property too. In one court record, a priest testified that he restored a fugitive to her rightful keeper in exchange for an offering. That phrase, rightful keeper, encapsulates the entire Athenian soul justice as custody. The city called this balance. To preserve harmony, someone had to bear the weight of suffering. And yet, despite the risk, some continued to run. Fragments of their defiance survive in Ostraka, and graffiti crude marks scratched into clay, "I am still alive." She runs to the sea. Freedom costs the body. Tiny rebellions buried under centuries of dust. Evidence that even in a civilization obsessed with control, the human instinct for escape refused to die. Still, most never made it beyond the city walls. Those who did often perished in the wilderness, hunted like animals. The few who found refuge among foreigners were declared lost property, their names erased from records. To be free, they had to cease existing legally. Athens' genius was to make slavery self-sustaining. Every layer of society benefited from obedience. The guards who enforced it, the citizens who profited, the priests who justified, the doctors who patched bodies for reuse. The city no longer needed constant violence. Fear did the work for it. Fear became the invisible infrastructure. When people say democracy began in Athens, they rarely mention what kept it standing. Not marble, not wisdom, fear. And yet the system contained its own poison. Because to maintain absolute control, Athens had to keep reminding its people what defiance looked like. And that meant staging cruelty again and again until violence became banal, until citizens could no longer tell the difference between order and horror. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the walls of the city were lined with unmarked graves. The wind that swept across them carried the same question that still echoes through history. How much control can a society exert before it loses its soul? The Athenian answer was simple. As long as the system survives, the soul is expendable. But systems do not last forever. What happens when time erases the masters and the ledgers alike, when all that remains of a civilization's order is the silent graveyard beneath it? History remembers marble. But beneath Athens, the marble that glows in textbooks and tourist guides, lies another monument, one built not of stone, but of silence. Archaeologists call them secondary deposits, shards of pottery, animal bones, ash. But mixed among them, too often to ignore, are fragments of the human, small, fragile, unmistakably female. Infants' ribs, pelvic bones twisted from repeated trauma, skulls with healed fractures, all without tombstones, without inscriptions. The graveyard that Athens forgot to mention. For centuries, the city dumped its unwanted there, prostitutes who died in childbirth, slaves beaten to death, infants born in brothels and strangled within minutes. The state buried them, not as citizens, not as criminals, not even as individuals, but as refuse. And yet, they built a democracy over this soil. When the Parthenon rose, its foundations rested on layers of unmarked graves. The laborers who carved the marble likely passed the very ravines where dead slaves were discarded. They saw the vultures circle, but said nothing, because silence was civic virtue. Excavations near the Kerameikos Cemetery, Athens' official burial ground, reveal the geography of moral exclusion. Citizens rested in stone sarcophagi engraved with verses about honor and lineage. A few meters away, pits filled with tangled bones and shards of amphorae, dumped bodies burned with pottery waste. The proximity is obscene. The celebrated and the erased sharing soil, yet worlds apart in memory. Archaeologists today classify those pits as ritual refuse zones, an elegant euphemism for what they are: mass graves. Some contain traces of perfume fragments of votive clay figurines. Perhaps small gestures of pity from those who couldn't protest publicly. A citizen could not build a tomb for a prostitute, but he could drop a token in the pit before the earth covered her. The city's ledgers never recorded their names yet. Their bones are the most honest archive Athens ever left. Each fracture, each scar, each healed break tells a truth that the orators refused to speak. When modern scientists examined these remains, they found signatures of labor and violence. Compressed vertebrae from carrying water jugs, pelvic asymmetry from repeated sexual assault, teeth worn down by malnutrition and stress grinding. The statistical pattern is clear systemic exploitation, not random suffering. Athens' democracy had a demographic shadow. For every citizen who voted, there were several who could not even be buried. And what makes this invisible graveyard unbearable is its continuity. For centuries, builders reused the soil, mixing human dust with lime and clay. The same earth that molded amphorae for wine or bricks for temples once held the ashes of the enslaved. The city recycled its dead. Each fragment of bone found today contradicts the idealized myth of the Golden Age. Textbooks speak of Socrates and Pericles of reason and art. But the bones whisper a different story of a civilization so proud of its beauty it buried its cruelty alive. The inscriptions that survive on marble praise the Athenian ideal isonomia, equality before law. Eleutheria, liberty. Sophrosyne, moderation. But equality for whom liberty? For whom moderation of what if? Not the conscience Athens' democracy was not built on contradiction. It was built on hierarchy, disguised as balance. For the citizen to exist, the slave had to vanish. The system demanded it. That is why these graves have no names. Memory would disrupt the mathematics of order. And yet in their anonymity lies defiance. Because these bones, unearthed 2 millennia later, still speak. They expose the ledger the city hid. They show that civilization is not what it builds, but what it buries. Every bone excavated from the Athenian dirt is an act of testimony. Each fragment says, I existed, even if the city said, I didn't. Imagine a future archaeologist finding our own ruins, the smartphones, the plastics, the unmarked graves of modern labor camps, and wondering how a people so advanced could tolerate such quiet suffering. The question will not be new. Athens already answered it. Civilization forgets selectively and calls that forgetting wisdom. The invisible graveyard is not only Athens' past, it is every society's mirror. Every temple courthouse and monument that rises on someone else's silence carries its echo. The Athenian soil is honest about that. It confesses even if we pretend not to hear. And so, the next time someone marvels at the perfection of the Parthenon, remember those columns are memorials too. They stand not just for democracy and reason, but for the cost of both the bodies, absorbed into the foundation, the lives erased, so that the marble could gleam unmarred by guilt. When the wind sweeps over the Acropolis, it carries dust from that graveyard. It moves through the cracks in the stones, settles on tourists' shoes, drifts into the air like unspoken history. The city still breathes its victims, because the dead of Athens never asked to be remembered. They asked only not to be buried twice, once in earth and once in forgetting. But even silence has philosophy. The graveyard forces a question that Athens itself never answered. How can a culture worship virtue while living off the suffering it refuses to see? Every civilization constructs its conscience as carefully as it builds its temples. Athens perfected this craft. It designed a moral architecture, columns of virtue, pediments of logic so symmetrical that it concealed what held it up, the crushed bodies of those denied humanity. The philosophers of Athens did not need to defend slavery. They assumed it. They did not need to justify sexual domination. They named it nature. Their silence was not ignorance. It was method. Socrates walked barefoot through the agora, asking questions about justice, courage, and the good life. But he never asked whose labor allowed him that leisure, or whose daughters were sold a few streets away. His virtue depended on selective sight. He examined the human soul while ignoring the human body, especially the bodies that were owned, branded, and broken. Plato. His disciple took this blindness and codified it into theory. In the Republic, he imagined a perfect society governed by reason, divided into classes ordained by nature. He spoke of harmony, but his harmony required silence, especially from women and slaves. The ideal state he designed excluded half of humanity from speech. The philosopher's paradise was built on mute labor, and Aristotle, the great classifier of nature, sealed the logic. He wrote, "For that some should rule, and others be ruled, is not only necessary, but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjection, others for command." To him, the hierarchy of master and slave mirrored the order of the cosmos. Justice was geometry, symmetrical, precise, and blind. Athens had achieved moral perfection not through compassion, but through abstraction. By turning inequality into philosophy, it removed guilt from cruelty. It transformed the brutal into the natural, the violent into the inevitable. The result was a city that could preach virtue while practicing domination. A democracy that could define freedom while living on bondage. Its moral beauty depended on blindness. But blindness was not an accident, it was discipline. To maintain empire, Athens trained itself not to see. The citizen learned to look past the slave carrying his water, the prostitute waiting at the corner, the child sweeping the floor of the symposium hall. Seeing them would fracture his self-image as rational and just. So, he learned to avert his gaze to call invisibility order. This was philosophy as anesthesia. The thinkers of Athens dissected ethics while anesthetizing empathy. They loved the word logos, reason, but their reason excluded those who could not speak it in Greek, or who spoke it while enslaved. The paradox is almost elegant. The civilization that birthed critical thought made blindness its highest form of wisdom. Even the tragedies, those proud mirrors of Athenian self-awareness, avoided reflection. Euripides and Sophocles wrote of kings and heroes, gods, and moral tests, but not of the thousands of women whose bodies funded the theatres where their plays premiered. When female pain appeared on stage, it was purified through metaphor. The slave's scream became poetry. The audience cried safely. Catharsis replaced conscience. And so, Athens built an ethics of distance, a way to feel morally pure while living amid horror. It's the same mechanism every modern society inherits. Distance transforms guilt into admiration. We mourn ancient suffering as heritage, admire cruelty as art, and call that understanding. Even the word philosophy, love of wisdom, carried this distance. It allowed thinkers to analyze the idea of justice without touching its victims. Philosophy was the art of moral insulation. When Socrates was sentenced to death, he drank the hemlock calmly convinced that reason would redeem him. His followers later celebrated his composure as the pinnacle of virtue. Yet, no one asked how many slaves prepared that cup, or what it meant that Athens, the city of law and mind, executed one of its own while ignoring the mass suffering it normalized daily. That contradiction is not failure, it is identity. Athens' moral brilliance required darkness around its edges. The same city that carved the word freedom into history also carved out half of humanity from its meaning. Philosophy's true invention was not logic, but justification, the ability to explain away atrocity in the language of order. Aristotle's natural slavery would echo through millennia, cited by theologians, monarchs, colonizers. Every empire that needed to believe in its virtue borrowed his geometry of domination. The idea that hierarchy is cosmic truth, that some exist to serve, was Athens' most enduring export. And even now we inherit that blindness. We admire Athens for its democracy, while ignoring who could not vote. We praise its art while forgetting who built it. We quote its philosophers while erasing those they erased. Modernity still walks the Athenian path, reasoning its way through cruelty, mistaking abstraction for absolution. The invisible graveyard beneath Athens was never a secret, it was a prerequisite. Civilization thrives not by confronting its victims, but by elevating itself above them and calling the view enlightenment. The philosophers' silence was not cowardice, it was architecture. They built moral systems sturdy enough to outlast the evidence of their own brutality. Perhaps that is why the Acropolis still stands, while the bones beneath it decay. Ideals endure longer than bodies, and blindness endures longer than guilt. But the graveyard's silence presses a question. The philosophers never answered. If reason can justify domination, what happens when reason becomes God? When civilization learns to rationalize anything, as long as it calls it progress? The philosophers of Athens did not see that question. They were too busy perfecting the art of not seeing. And so we arrive at the final truth, the afterlife of their silence. The modern world still kneels before Athens, praising its wisdom while repeating its blindness. What survives of virtue when built upon erasure? What remains of civilization when its ghosts still whisper beneath its stones? Messalina's story did not vanish with her body. It seeped into Rome's bloodstream, into the way power dressed itself, justified itself, and punished itself. Every empire that came after inherited her grammar domination, disguised as morality spectacle, repackaged as virtue, humiliation institutionalized as order. Her reign was not a scandal of lust. It was a blueprint for civilization's appetite for control through shame. Even centuries later, Rome still whispered her name when speaking of corruption. But what they refused to admit was this: she had not corrupted Rome. Rome had created her. She was the purest expression of its contradictions. A society that worshipped virtue but celebrated conquest, that adored beauty, yet fed on submission, could only ever produce an empress who turned those contradictions into law. After her execution, the city returned to its rituals, processions of piety, sacrifices to the gods, vows of renewal. The same streets where her wedding to Silius had marched now echoed with prayers for divine forgiveness. But under the incense and chants, nothing had changed. Rome remained addicted to spectacle. It only shifted the stage from Messalina's bedroom to the amphitheater, from private humiliation to public execution. When Nero ascended, he studied her story with fascination. He too learned that fear could be entertainment, that scandal could cleanse politics. What Messalina had invented in secret chambers, he broadcast in arenas. He turned empire into theatre, her legacy amplified to imperial scale. In that sense, she was not an aberration. She was prophecy. And as the centuries unfolded, her ghost travelled beyond Rome. Medieval chroniclers turned her into a cautionary tale. Renaissance painters transformed her into erotic allegory, and modern historians labelled her a pervert to preserve their own civility. Yet, beneath every retelling lay the same truth. Societies need their Messalinas. They need figures to absorb their moral guilt, to embody the sins that sustain their order. The whore, the witch, the hysteric, the immoral woman, each is a reincarnation of the Empress, erased yet never gone. Because shame is not merely punishment, it's control. It disciplines desire by displaying its consequences. Rome's true genius was not in law or architecture. It was in codifying shame as governance. Messalina showed how effectively humiliation could regulate behavior long after the whip had stopped. And the modern world still obeys that lesson. Think of the echoes political scandals turned into moral theatre, tabloid trials disguised as justice, the fascination with fallen women, disgraced leaders, public confession. Every age reenacts Rome's addiction to moral spectacle. The difference is only the medium. Where Messalina's downfall was carved in marble and blood, ours unfolds on screens and headlines. But the logic is identical. Power maintains itself by staging sin, then punishing it publicly. Philosophers call this the economy of shame, a system in which every civilization must manufacture transgression in order to prove its virtue. Messalina was its prototype. Her story became Western civilization's favorite ritual. Condemn what secretly fascinates, destroy what quietly sustains. Rome erased her name to declare its purity. In doing so, it enshrined her forever. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth. When we look back at her, we are not looking at a monster. We are looking at a mirror. The empress who ruled through pleasure merely exposed the empire's dependency on it. Her excess was not deviance, it was revelation. She stripped the mask off Roman order and showed that beneath marble and rhetoric lay the same desire to dominate and to be dominated, to gaze and to be shamed. If power has a soul, Messalina revealed its anatomy. It is not forged in courage or intellect, but in performance. How one commands attention bends morality and survives exposure. That is why her story refuses to die. Because every empire, every institution, every spectacle of moral outrage still rehearses her script. In the end, her life answers the question that haunted Rome. What happens when the body becomes the empire's stage? The answer is that civilization itself begins to mirror her disease. Beautiful, disciplined, radiant on the surface, and quietly rotting underneath. The ruins of the Palatine still glow at sunset gold and silent. Tourists climb the hill, snapping photos of faded frescoes, unaware that beneath those stones lie the foundations of a city built on humiliation. The wind that moves through those corridors carries no words, but if it did, it would whisper her final truth. The spectacle never ends. When the empires fell, when the marble crumbled, when the philosophers preached virtue again, the machinery of shame survived. And in that survival lies her victory. Messalina's name may have been condemned, but her method became eternal. Her legacy is not lust. It is civilization's addiction to humiliation as proof of order. That is why history cannot bury her, because to bury her is to bury its own reflection.